So I just want to start with asking people to throw again into the chat box just anything around their sort of lives in terms of, do you take action in your own personal lives that you would consider, green or ethical in nature? So, for example, do you have a solar panel on your roof at home, or do you use a car club or a bicycle hire scheme, or do you walk to work or to study? Do you try and really adjust your life given the sort of impacts that you're aware of? I mean, in some cases, there's questions like, do you try and look for a greener option when you fly? If you're going to take a flight, and some of you may not take flights, but if you do take a flight, do you look for the greener option online? And what is that greener option based on? Is it based on a composition of sustainable aviation fuel in the mix, or is it based on the navigational routes that the aeroplane takes to get to your destination? Other things are, people interested in electric cars. Do people, have an electric car, or would they like an electric car, for example? Do you have a green energy supplier for your home? Do you buy, green or renewable electricity from a energy company, or do you generate, your own energy? These are the sort of questions that I'm interested in finding out about my audience in terms of, to what extent people are taking action around this topic, because I guess, it's about a better life. I called my current business Sustainable Future for All because I think we would all like improvements. When we deal with the challenges of life, we'd all like a better life for ourselves and for our families and for others. And so how do we have a better life? What sort of choices do we need to make in our own lives to make a sustainable future for all? Sustainable Future for All is my own limited company, and it enables me to be independent and advise a lot of different clients, both in the private sector and in the public sector. Earlier in my journey, I am from South Africa originally. I'm not sure if any of you can sort of tell that my accent is not English. It's actually South African. I grew up in Johannesburg, down at the bottom of Africa. And I grew up during a very unfortunate moment in South Africa's history, which was apartheid. Apartheid was legislated racial discrimination based on the color of one's skin, and it was a horrible societal norm to be birthed into. And as I grew up, I started realizing, the sickness of the society that I lived in, where you actually have racial discrimination based on skin color. And of course, being a white South African, I was on the privileged side of that, and I got, you could say that I benefited enormously is the fact from my childhood in apartheid South Africa being at the top of the system, but there was a sickness that pervaded for everybody, and no matter where you are in the pecking order, you sort of do realize when you're living in a society that is very sick, it's unjust, it's unhealthy, and you feel the need to do something about that. You talk to close friends, you make trusted relationships with people who also want to change something. So I became a bit of a change maker at a young age. And I would say that was about social justice, right? Now, I'm sure many of you know who Nelson Mandela is or was. And he became our hero in South Africa. He was in jail for 27 years. And then finally, there was a change of government in the apartheid regime, and a new president decided to release Nelson Mandela from life in prison on an island called Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town, the bottom of South Africa. And he came ashore and he came into civil society And everyone was, well, what is this person going to be like? And he turned out to be incredibly gracious, forgiving, and an amazing leader that had we've been waiting in the wings for his moment. He stepped onto the stage and he became, within 4 years of being released from prison, he became the president of South Africa, the new South Africa. And that was a glorious moment, a very happy moment for all of us who were there to witness it. I was actually, right there in the square in Cape Town when he was released from prison, and was within 10 feet of him when he made his first speech as a free person. And I was also there in the amphitheater, circular amphitheater, on that great day in 1994 when he was sworn in as our president of the new South Africa. We had just had a democratic elections, first democratic elections, and that brought to power the ANC and President Mandela. People of color had not been able to vote in previous elections. It was not a democracy. It was an authoritarian, let's call it fascist regime, unfortunately. Anyway, that was a great moment. And I want to talk about that in the sense of what's that got to do with sustainability, right? Well, sustainability, when you think of it, do you think of the environmental side of sustainability? A lot of people immediately think sustainability is about the environmental side. Other people think, no, it's also about the people side, the social side, responsibility, equality, justice, and advancement. So human progress, our future generations, children and their children. So the social side, and then others would say, well, no, hang on a second. I'm a business person. It's actually about being financially sustainable. That's the most important part of sustainability. So there are these different ways to look at sustainability. And I ask you again, think about that. What is sustainability? It's a long word. And you being interested in this topic, I'm sure, have looked into it. But sustainability, it's really short for being sustainable, the ability to be sustainable. It was coined in a definition in the late 80s through the Brundtland Commission. The exact words that the Brundtland Commission used to define sustainable development, which was shortened then to sustainability, is the following: meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So immediately something about custodianship, stewardship for future generations, finite resources, people competing for access to land, labor, and capital in the capitalist model. How do we make sure that there is the safeguarding and the shepherding of these finite, precious resources that the planet provides for us, that the Earth systems provide for human life? How do we ensure that these are looked after for future generations? So sustainability has been around, as a concept for some decades. And in my experience, it's gone from a niche, really at the edges where just some people were talking about this quite long word, sustainability, and others were, well, what's that? We're not connected to that thing over there called sustainability. And it's really become quite mainstream, in my view, over the 3 decades that I've been working in sustainability. And I've been very pleased to see that has caught on. So it's become quite a well-known discipline, if you like, or a value system, or a whole expertise area, which people are now getting degrees in, they're working in, they're becoming professionals in. When I was a teenager, there was no such thing as becoming a sustainability professional. So we had to find other ways to get into this field. For me, it was, as I said, the social justice angle of being involved in the public sector. And then I was also interested in conservation and wildlife, being from the southern tip of Africa, with the privileges of going and seeing the big five, which are lion, leopard, elephant, rhino, and buffalo. And as a young boy, I would learn about those particular animals and others, but I'd be able to learn about when I saw a footprint in the sand, what kind of animal that was and how long ago it had been in that particular place, and would I be able to find it if we would go that way? Could I track it and get there? So yeah, that was the route that I took into this. But so there are different ways to look at sustainability and to be connected to sustainability. As I progressed in my career, I found that not only was I interested in the public sector and the sort of governmental, the framework side of sustainability, social and environmental justice and economic opportunities for all, but also I then became interested in, well, how do you implement sustainability through business and society? So, what did it mean to create, for example, a business case for being more sustainable? How do you get sustainability into the DNA, into the lifeblood of an organization, whether that be a small business, a large business, a multinational, or even any kind of organization, academic institution, governmental institution, NGO, etc. What did it mean to live sustainably? And I quite soon realized that we're talking about a journey. There's a proverb from the African continents, from an ancient people, the San people, which is take care of the steps and the journey will take care of itself. And so I started seeing, well, if we just start trying to find ways to improve, then maybe we can get to this better life, this more sustainable life for all. And so when I started looking into being involved in businesses, I thought, well, where shall I start? And the obvious place for me to start was in the extractive, the heavy oil and gas and mining companies, because of course, they have a huge impact on both the planet and on society. They make a lot of money from getting oil and gas, for example, in one example, or let's say gold and diamonds in South Africa was a very prevalent business activity. Make a lot of money from doing these extractive industries. And the question is, well, what are the impacts that they're having, both positive and negative, on society and the planet? So you construct a business case. You look at opportunities and risks around the social case, the environmental case, and the economic or financial case. And you try and build that up into a business argument for taking action. There are trade-offs between those three pillars, but you try and put it to the board or to the leadership team of a company. This is what we think we should do as a result of these risks and opportunities. And so if you imagine a wedding cake, in different cultures, wedding cakes are different. In my culture, a wedding cake is typically 3 or 4 layers. And the bottom layer of a wedding cake is the biggest layer, of course, because it's constructed on top of that foundation. You have the middle layer of the wedding cake, and you have the top layer of the wedding cake. Now, if you think that in terms of sustainability or sustainable development, the bottom layer of that wedding cake is the environment and the planet. Let's call it the planet. The planet where we all live. We only have one home. We don't live in space on any other planet. We live right here, one home, one planet. All of us together. Now 8 billion people. When my great-grandfather was born, there was only 1.5 billion people. So there's a lot of us living in a finite space, Earth, one home, right? On top of that, you have the space itself, planet, and you have the 8 billion people, society living on and in the planet. And then with human activities, obviously you have economic generation. So you have the economy that's generated as that third layer of the wedding cake. And what I like about that framework, which is a Johan Rockstrom and team from the Stockholm Resilience Institute framework, what I like about that so much is it's a very good way to think of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the UN, as I mentioned with the Brundtland Commission, came up with the definition of sustainability in the late 80s and early 90s. We had the Rio Summit in 1992, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, and we had the UN framework of the global goals, which are now known as the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are 17 of those goals. Now, when you think of those 17, you can divide them into the three layers of the wedding cake. So the planet goals, the societal goals, and the economic goals. Now, with implementing sustainability, let's take a couple of examples to try and make this more practical. So when I was looking at, for example, oil and gas companies, one of the companies that I started consulting to because I got a job back in London in my late 20s, which was consulting to clients like Shell. So Shell became a client that I got to know quite well, spent a lot of time researching and evaluating and then advising members of Shell who were working there on their activities in different countries. And the two big stories of the day in regards to Shell and oil, one was out of Nigeria and what Shell was doing to people and to the planet in Nigeria, the Niger Delta, and also the Ogoni people. Ken Saro-Wiwa was the person that I looked into because he ended up losing his life because of Shell's real greed in Nigeria for oil and the collision between Shell wanting to get oil and gas out the ground and Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni people resisting Shell. And, there was a fight and basically Ken Saro-Wiwa lost his life over that. So, this is real tragedy from doing core business activities. And the question becomes, what is the sort of moral case for this, right? At the same time as the economic case. Is it just about money, or is there also a moral situation here where there's constraints on what businesses do, of course. Similarly, Shell was getting into trouble just off the coast of Great Britain with the Brent Spar, which was a big oil storage buoy. And they just decided that they wanted to decommission it. Instead of towing it in and dismantling it, they were just going to sink it into the sea, to the bottom of the ocean, and leave it there. And various people decided that that wasn't acceptable. That was just pollution, extreme litter of the ocean. And so they resisted and said, no, we can't let them do that. And even though the British government had already agreed to allow this Dutch-based company, Shell, to do this, there were people in Germany, for example, who said, no, that's not acceptable. We also live in Europe, and why should a Dutch company be allowed by the British government to put this thing just into the bottom of the ocean? Not right. So these became case studies around issues and how to manage issues or what to make of these issues. And there's some really ugly issues in business that become real problems for society and for the planet. In my home country, there's a huge big crater called the Kimberley Hole, which you can see from space, where a lot of diamonds have been mined over 200 years by big diamond mining companies, using very cheap labor to get out lots of diamonds. Is that acceptable? For then people to wear these diamonds on their hands, engagement rings, or around their neck, earrings, is that acceptable, right? So I guess the question for me as a sustainability professional was, well, how do we change this into responsible citizenship, responsible corporate behavior? What does that mean? Do you create that case? And if you take an example of a company called Interface, it's an American manufacturing company, heavy industry, around making flooring for offices and for homes, but large commercial flooring, think carpets, textiles, and had lots of factories, which we use the word factories in Britain. In America, they call factories plants, which I've always find quite ironic because a plant in nature is zero pollution. But a plant, being a factory in America, creating pollution out of manufacturing of heavy industry, it's still called a plant, but it's not clean. It's not zero waste, that's for sure. So here came the question for the chief exec and founder of Interface at one point, when he suddenly realized, because one of his customers was complaining about the pollution that a community was being affected by from one of his plants, and the customer and the community were complaining to him, saying, "We're going to stop buying your products, Mr. Interface, unless you change your ways, unless you start doing something about pollution." Some of us might have seen a film called Erin Brockovich, which is about a similar topic in US industry. It became very famous. Now, in the case of Interface, this chief exec became very famous because he was one of the first chief execs in the world to say, actually, I want to have a zero waste, a zero pollution manufacturing company. So he called all his team together. At that point, I think there were 300 staff or so of the leadership team. He called them together for a 2-day conference, and he said, the challenge I'm giving you is, how do we make this company mission zero? And he said, I'm off. I'll come back at the end of the 2 days, and you guys tell me, how are we going to do that? So they set on the journey of trying to do that. They called it climbing Mount Sustainability, because it's not an easy journey when you're trying to make a heavy manufacturing polluting company into a mission zero company. But eventually this chief exec, before he passed away, he wrote a book called Confessions of a Radical Industrialist. And I highly recommend that book because it talks about how they went about it, what they learned, and what they can pass on to other people. Now, when I started getting involved in other sectors of advising on becoming more sustainable, the first was retail. After, for example, manufacturing and oil and gas, it was retail. And in retail, there became a thing about being seen by your customers to have the more responsible image, and your products that they were buying in the grocery store, in the supermarkets, were coming from a brand that you could trust. So it became a competition in Britain between companies like Marks and Spencer, M&S for short, or Tesco, or Waitrose, or Sainsbury's, as to, well, what were they doing on sustainability? And customers were starting to ask. So this became fascinating for me as someone who, likes to see folks trying to be good and doing that in a way that's healthy. So a kind of race between the different teams from those different companies on doing the right thing. And the company that I got most involved in was Tesco, and it was really quite easy to find ways, which I call win-win-win ways, to save money, to reduce negative environmental impacts or reduce pollution, and to do something that the customers and the staff thought, that's great stuff. So, for example, I'll give you a little one, which is when you put a sliding door on a refrigerator that's got lots of consumables, let's say cheese, bread, cheese, milk, yogurts and things. And if you put a sliding door there, then of course immediately you're reducing the energy consumption. You're making it more efficient. It's less cold in the aisle for the customer and the staff. And immediately to the bottom line, you're getting good savings on cutting your energy costs. So that's a win-win-win. And that's just a simple thing of putting a sliding door on a refrigeration aisle in a supermarket. Um, now, there's a lot of other things that we then went on to do, but that was just the first learning. Well, we can do a lot here, right? And so it gets more fundamental, depending on how polluting the particular industry is. So that's why often you hear this question about, well, there's only 100 companies around the world that are producing 75% of the world's greenhouse gases. Um, and when you think about that, it becomes, well, surely it's just a question of going straight to those 100 companies. Don't worry about the country so much, just go to those 100 big multinational companies. And if we can change the way they do business, then of course everyone benefits. And, those of us who have small businesses or who are not big ExxonMobil or RWE or Hitachi or Toshiba or something, then we don't have to worry too much as long as they do their bit. But what I found is actually everyone needs to do their little bit. It's like every little helps, funnily enough, was the slogan of the Tesco company that I was just referring to. Every little helps. And it's so true. So, it's also very difficult if someone is saying, well, you should do it, but I don't have to do anything. So how to make it second nature, the English expression second nature is that it comes naturally. It's second nature to me. It's like eating, sleeping, breathing becomes second nature. So how do we make sustainability, this long word, which we now have talked about what it means, how do we make that second nature in every organization, whether that's a business, big or small, whether that's a public sector or third sector organization of any size, or even in a family, in a house? How do we make it second nature? And it's, not easy. I mean, there's certain things you can do to start the journey, but that journey is a continuous improvement journey of thinking a bit more about what the impacts of one's behavior is all about. And as a sole agent or operator, actor, let's call it, it's quite difficult to make collective wins. You can do so much in your own life, but unless you collaborate with the community around you, with other businesses, with other countries, it's very difficult to make fundamental shifts. So we call that radical collaboration. I quite like that word radical in front of collaboration because, yes, it's about collaboration, but it's about radical collaboration. It's collaboration that immediately you may not have thought of, like collaboration between different kinds of companies, different kinds of sectors as well. So, for example, with artificial intelligence now coming in as a massive commercial opportunity and lots of excitement around creating AI and robotic solutions, you bring that together with, for example, climate challenges. AI for climate can yield a whole lot of solutions that we never thought were possible before artificial intelligence. So that's exciting. And there's a phrase, again, an old saying that comes out of Africa, which is if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And sustainability is about that going far because it's not just about us who are alive right now, it's also about the generations that come afterwards. So this gets us to leadership, taking stands, taking positions, doing things, convincing other people to do things. Leadership that yields better outcomes for the world and for the people of the world. And in taking that leadership, you think about the leaders who you admire, who you respect, who've inspired you to change. I mentioned the Nelson Mandela example, but even if it's a celebrity, it could be a famous person that one admires, and you think, well, what do they do in their life? So let's say, for example, an actor. There's an actor like Leonardo DiCaprio, right? A lot of people know about Leonardo DiCaprio. A lot of people know that he cares about climate change. So then the question is, well, what is Leonardo DiCaprio doing about climate change. At the moment, people are watching about the women who've gone to space for 10 minutes, including Katy Perry, the famous singer. And there's a lot of controversy about that's a lot of money to go into space for 10 minutes to take some pictures and come back down. Was that a good thing or was that a bad thing? And, with all that money, could we have not done a whole lot of other things that could be helpful for a better life for all? So we're now getting into the territory of sort of, really wanting to see what people think about this revolution or evolution question that we posed at the beginning. Because I think my views have also changed on this as I've worked in this field. Because if I go back to that definition of sustainability, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, that's evolution. That's quite simple. But then if you think of where we are right now in terms of the other phrase I mentioned, which was the Chinese for crisis, danger and opportunity, what has happened with that equation, danger and opportunity, in my lifetime is hugely significant. So there's a hell of a lot more danger now than there was when I was in my 20s regarding this whole agenda. But there's also a hell of a lot more opportunity in terms of solving these massive problems, because it seems to me, I'm sure you will mainly agree with me, that wherever you look right now, there are risks. There's examples of signs that the planet and people are getting impatient, are having enough of what's been going on. So whether it's the Earth speaking to us in the sense of natural catastrophes and ecosystem collapse, saying enough is enough, as nature, we are saying to you people, you are not treating us very well. 8 billion people being like locusts on the planet, devouring our resources, from the nature side, looking to the people side, from the people side, looking to the nature side, also saying, well, this is unsustainable what we are doing to nature, and having arguments with each other, where one person will say, we're heading for 3 degrees centigrade increase in temperature, which is going to be horrific for life on Earth. Another person might say, oh, well, it's always been cyclical, up and down in terms of the climate. Humans don't really have any effect, and we don't really have to worry because we'll all be fine. And this argument, as you can see, is playing itself out in various countries around the world, most notably in America, where it's split down the middle between the people who say, actually, we've really got to change in the way we treat each other and the way we treat the planet. Other people saying, well, don't worry about the planet. She'll take care of herself. And we actually have to go back to what we were like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where we didn't have so many people of different cultures or whatever, and it's just got too complicated for us and we don't like it anymore. We want to have what we did have when we first had whatever we had. So it's a ironic situation, but clearly danger has gone up and opportunity has gone up too, in the sense of the number of people wanting to do something about the problem and the technologies that are being invented and commercialized to yield the solution. So you take solar panels. When I was in my 20s, not many people were putting solar panels on their roofs. It was too expensive. The solar panels themselves weren't very good, weren't very sophisticated or efficient, and the price was too high. And the payback as a business person was way too long. So people were like, well, if you're privileged, if you're very wealthy, maybe you can go and put a solar panel. I'm not going to bother. Now, that solar cost curve, as you know, has just come right down, 10% per year for the last 25 years. And now solar is the cheapest form of electricity on the planet. And now if you're not putting solar panel on your roof, you're kind of thinking, well, I mean, everyone should be doing it, right? It's kind of obvious. So things change and the opportunities change with it. I mean, I just mentioned solar as one example, but every day something new happens with a new technology. Let's say it's using the tides or using the waves or using wind in different ways. So wind turbines that go like that, but also wind turbines that go like that, vertical and horizontal axis, for example, or geothermal, getting energy from beneath the crust. Lots of energy there. Pumped storage, so pumping water up and then it comes down and generates, getting water mills that stopped being used when we had too much coal and too much oil. And now maybe we get those water mills going again with much more updated technology. So lots of opportunities. And then the question is, how do you attract investment from all the big investors or different kinds of investors into the mainstream of those solutions so that people are switching from investing in oil and gas and putting their pensions through their pension schemes in that stuff to the good stuff. And that's not easy because the playing field that we're operating on at the moment hasn't really changed. So even though the danger and the opportunities have changed a lot, playing field in terms of the economic framework, the rules of the game is still very much the same that it was a couple of hundred years ago with basic flows of capitalism, right? Land, labor, capital, throughputs, creating value and shareholder return. And, most people thinking business is just about shareholder return in the short term and share price if you're a listed company. So, for example, BP will say, oh, well, we're not going to do any solar and wind anymore because our share price only moves the more stuff we get out of the ground on oil and gas. And I confess, I went to BP for 6 years of my life after business school, and we did, when I was there, try to change this big oil giant into a green energy company. It didn't work. I mean, we made progress while I was there, but it got unraveled. The successor of our time said, oh, well, all that renewable alternative energy is a waste of time. We want to go back to oil and gas. So I'm coming sort of towards the end of my talk here, and I hope you're still with me. I think it's back to this question of values, right? Value systems and how that changes in time. So if I think back in historical terms, sitting here in Great Britain, this was once the center of a great empire called the British Empire. And that empire was built on trading and ships. So the Brits had amazing ships, amazing fleets, an amazing navy, and traded their pliers all over the world, as people know. And the ships were the key thing. And of course, before we had steam, we had human slavery. And the ships were powered by humans through slavery. And so the foundation of the economy in those times, 300-400 years ago, was built on the backs of slave labor, literally in those ships. Now, you will know that human slavery in the form of the Abolition of Slavery Act, it came about in the 1800s, first in the UK with William Wilberforce and the abolitionists who ended up getting passed through the House of Commons in British Parliament, the Abolition of Slavery Act. And then in America, a huge civil war over the issue of slavery was fought between the Confederates and the North, the Unionists. And that was won decisively in the end by Abraham Lincoln and the Unionists. And that was finally the end of the slavery era officially in America. And we moved on to the fossil fuel era because of steam, coal, and then oil and gas. So now the question is, how do we fundamentally move on beyond the fossil fuel era? Because as we've been listening and thinking about, fossil fuels are the foundation of both the problems and the opportunities, right? Yes, they bring people out of poverty in many societies, but they create so much pollution and degradation at the same time. So fossil fuels has become the problem, especially with 8, 9 billion people on the planet. So how do we shift to a new situation, a new paradigm, a new playing field beyond fossil fuels? And I want to just mention in the end of my talk here, I want to mention a book that's really struck a chord with me. And, I've been introduced as special advisor of Rethink X. This book is called Stellar. Stellar, think star. Think how a star is in terms of its nature, and think of what it means for a star to be born, both literally and metaphorically. And could we get to another paradigm beyond the extractive paradigm, as it says in this book, which is called stellar, which is not based on fossil fuels, which is not competitive, driven by the growth at all costs driver of human behavior, that either I have it or you have it. We have to fight each other for land, labor, and capital. And some of us get very wealthy, others get downtrodden, and you have this very unsustainable situation where, now I think it's 25 billionaires in the West own more wealth than most of Africa put together, right? And there are lots of those sorts of examples of inequality, inequity. So could we move beyond this into a collaborative, sustainable future for all, where inequality becomes equality, where we don't compete for planetary resources in a way that is of greed and win or lose, zero-sum game? And it might just be possible, as Nelson Mandela once said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And this new system would be based on decentralized clean energy systems, think solar, wind, and batteries, for example, that mushroom up in nodes, a little bit like how the internet was created for the flow of information. And as we know, that information flows for free, and we all have access to that information on our fingertips online. Could the same thing happen with a superabundance of clean energy provided by these network nodes that get formed all over the world? They mushroom up in a interconnected way, a clean energy system that then brings us opportunities of a circular economy, which is restorative, where nature rebounds and gets replenished, where we collaborate, where you no longer need the inputs of land, labor, capital, because once you've got that superabundant system, it's self-sufficient, self-generating, infinite, like a star. And isn't that a fantastically exciting opportunity if we can make that work? And I think it is about being stellar humans in the same way as moving from extractive to stellar, moving from competitive to collaborative. We become more stellar in nature. And the behaviors of a stellar human would be very different from the behaviors that we see now, which are becoming increasingly ugly and disconcerting when we look around. So I want to leave you with that. Sustainability, revolution, or evolution? Do we need something completely different? And is this a bottom-up change that sweeps the board like a tidal wave and throws the old out, overwhelms the old, the sort of drill baby drill mentality of the old world, and brings in this new era where humans really step up and become much kinder, much more likable, much more human, and the planet is regenerated and flourishes? Wouldn't that be good? Thank you very much.